A security officer shoved a black CEO down an escalator. He had no idea that moment would end his entire career. He thought pushing a man down the stairs would make him fall from dignity. He didn't realize the one he shoved had climbed through worse battles before. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always trips over its own pride. The heel of Darian Cole's dress shoe landed on the topmost metal ridge of the Ascend Terminal escalator just as the security officer's arm shot out in front of him. "Routine inspection," the man said flatly. Darian stopped mid-step, a slight jolt running through his knee as he adjusted his stance to keep balance. The escalator hummed beneath his feet, its rhythm steady, mechanical. He turned, face calm, though the lines in his jaw grew tight. The officer, tall, rigid, mid-40s, had a patrol cap tucked neatly over short-cropped gray hair. His badge read Brent Larker, and the patch over his chest bore the insignia of Ascend Terminal Security. But it was not the uniform that made Darian pause. It was the officer's eyes. Cold, dismissive, calculating. "What kind of inspection?" Darian asked evenly, adjusting the strap of his leather briefcase. Brent didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped to the ID clipped to Darian's lapel, Titan Aeronautics CEO in clean font beneath the company's brushed steel logo. The corner of Brent's mouth twitched. "CEO, huh?" he said with a low scoff. "Fancy title for someone like you." Darian didn't blink. He'd heard it before, those subtle jabs dressed in uniforms and protocol. He straightened his tie with a single motion, holding the officer's stare. "If there's an issue, I'd like to resolve it quickly." "I have a flight to catch." Brent tilted his head, mock considering. "It'll only take a second." He stepped closer, enough that Darian caught the faint scent of cigarette smoke beneath a layer of cheap aftershave. "We can do this easy, or you can make it hard. Your choice." Darian exhaled slowly, measuring the moment. He knew the game. He had played it before, in boardrooms, in elevators, in interviews where assumptions greeted him before a handshake did. But this was different. Public. Exposed. He gave a short nod. "Then, let's be quick." Brent's hand moved to Darian's shoulder as if to guide him, but there was no guiding. There was pressure. A subtle shove. Darian stepped back instinctively, but the escalator's motion had already resumed beneath him. He lost balance. There was no time to recover. His foot caught behind him on the metal edge, and gravity took control in an instant. His briefcase slipped from his hand, tumbling down first. Darian's body followed with a sickening blur of motion, his back striking the ridged steel steps, shoulder twisting violently. His head snapped backward with the momentum, and crack. The lower platform met his skull with a dull, echoing thud. Gasps tore through the terminal like a sudden wind. The air seemed to still, time stretching. A child's voice cried out. A man dropped his coffee. A woman clutched her boarding pass to her chest, frozen in place. Darian didn't move. Blood began to pool beneath his temple. A slow, steady bloom against the pale floor. Above, Brent stood at the top of the escalator, looking down. His face was unreadable at first, then quickly replaced with faux concern as several passengers turned their heads toward him. "He tripped," Brent said, loud enough for them to hear. "Didn't follow instructions." "Slipped before I could catch him." No one responded. But several sets of eyes had watched the moment. Their minds were still catching up to what they had seen, what they thought they had seen. And above them all, unnoticed, the dome of a security camera blinked faintly red, still recording. As airport staff hurried toward the scene, Brent began descending, feigning urgency. He knelt beside Darian, who was beginning to stir, his breath shallow, eyes fluttering open. "You all right, sir?" Brent asked in a tone laced with practiced sympathy. "You really should watch your footing." Darian blinked against the fluorescent lights overhead. Pain screamed from the back of his skull. His vision doubled for a second, then steadied just enough to see Brent's face hovering above him. He didn't speak. Not yet. From across the terminal, 2 paramedics rushed in, rolling a stretcher. One of them, a younger man with square shoulders and a furrowed brow, crouched to examine the gash near Darian's temple. "He's conscious," the medic said. "Skull impact. We need to stabilize him." Another officer approached from the side, not yet speaking as he took in the scene. Brent stood quickly. "He didn't comply with inspection," Brent repeated, louder this time as if saying it twice would make it true. "Got defensive." Fell, trying to back away. The other officer nodded vaguely, still watching Darian, still unsure. Darian coughed, the metallic taste of blood in his throat. He turned his head slowly and rasped, voice dry and raw. "He pushed me." Brent's mask of sympathy broke for half a second, just enough for the nearest passenger to notice the change in his face. "He's delirious," Brent said quickly, gesturing at the gash. "Must have hit pretty hard." The medics lifted Darian gently, strapping him onto the stretcher. He winced, pain pulsing through his shoulder now too. But in his mind, clarity was beginning to form like a rising tide. The fall wasn't just physical. This had been deliberate, calculated. He turned his head slightly and caught the glint of a camera high on the wall. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. But Darian built aircraft guidance systems for a living. He saw patterns, devices, trajectories. He saw what others missed. Brent didn't look up. He didn't think he needed to. And that was the mistake. The stretcher began to roll forward, weaving through a crowd now buzzing with whispers. A middle-aged man pulled out his phone. A younger one muttered something to a companion. No one spoke loud enough to challenge the uniformed authority, but no one quite looked convinced either. In the stillness, Darian closed his eyes again, letting the pain wash through him like a tide breaking against stone. He would remember this moment. Every sound, every word, every lie. They thought they'd buried the truth beneath uniforms and badges. But the camera had seen. The silence that followed the fall wouldn't last long. What falls in silence often rises with thunder. The metallic groan of the escalator echoed in Darian Cole's ears as he tumbled down its jagged slope, his body striking edge after edge in a helpless descent. The final impact, the base platform, sent a bolt of agony through his skull. A crack of bone against steel. Then silence. Blinding silence. Blood seeped down the side of his face, warm and slow, pooling near his temple. Around him, gasps filled the air. Luggage dropped, feet scuffled. Someone screamed faintly, but it felt miles away. Darian's vision fractured like broken glass, streaks of light spinning around him. He tried to focus, but his eyes fluttered, heavy with pain. One hand twitched, reaching for something solid, but the only thing beneath him was the cold, vibrating metal of the floor. His shoulder throbbed where he'd tried to break the fall, torn fabric, exposed skin, a dull sting growing sharper by the second. Paramedics rushed in moments later, their shoes clattering against the terminal floor. Their voices were sharp and efficient, clipped with urgency. Head trauma, possible concussion. Fractured clavicle or shoulder. Pupils sluggish but responsive. Let's get him stabilized. As they knelt beside him, Brent Larker stood just out of their way, arms folded, face set in a mask of false concern. "He tripped," he said loudly, addressing no one in particular. "I gave a verbal warning." He didn't comply. Got agitated. Lost his balance. One of the medics looked up, skeptical but silent. Another leaned closer to Darian. "Sir? Can you hear me? Can you tell us what happened?" Darian's lips moved slowly as if weighed down by gravity itself. The words rasped from his throat like sand. "He pushed me." Brent chuckled, the sound dry and dismissive. Delirium. Probably from the impact. Took a bad fall. Poor guy's confused. A hush settled for a moment before heavier footsteps approached, methodical, commanding. Rafe Doran, the airport's head of security, emerged from the crowd, his presence a sudden shadow over the scene. Tall, broad-shouldered, and clean-shaven with silvering temples, Rafe looked more like a politician than an officer. His crisp navy uniform bore no wrinkles, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. His gaze scanned the area, not with concern, but calculation. He took in the smear of blood, the fallen briefcase, Brent's rigid posture, and Darian's prone form. His jaw clenched. "What's the situation?" he asked flatly. Brent stepped forward, quickly seizing the moment. Subject refused inspection. I attempted verbal de-escalation. He turned aggressive, lost balance on the escalator. Impact was unfortunate. Rafe's eyes narrowed, but he gave a single nod. "We'll review footage," he said without inflection, as if reciting procedure. But his tone lacked the neutrality expected of a man in his position. It sounded more like dismissal than intent. The paramedics began lifting Darian onto a stretcher. Pain lanced through his shoulder as they adjusted him. He winced, teeth gritted, but kept his eyes open, barely. Then, from the edge of his blurred vision, a shadow stepped closer. A young man, barely in his 20s, short cropped hair, and a security team badge clipped nervously to his belt. Nolan Frey. He didn't speak loudly. He leaned in under the pretense of assisting the medics and whispered close to Darian's ear. "Sir, the feed didn't delete like he thinks." Darian's breath hitched. It wasn't the pain this time. It was clarity cutting through fog. Someone inside knew. Someone hadn't played along. That single sentence, whispered like a lifeline, was the first real shift in momentum since the shove. Then Nolan stepped back, vanishing into the moving crowd of uniforms. The ambulance ride was a blur, beeping machines, flashing lights, sterile smells. But Darian's mind was no longer focused on the gash at his temple or the ache in his bones. His thoughts had shifted entirely. This wasn't the first time he'd faced humiliation. Not the first time someone saw his position and skin and decided it was too high, too proud. But this time, he had a witness. A crack in the armor of silence. An ally with access. As he lay in the hospital room, fluorescent lights humming above him, the words kept circling his mind like fuel on flame. The feed didn't delete. That meant records, evidence, a lie caught in the act. A nurse gently adjusted the sling around his arm. A different medic cleaned the blood from his forehead. No one asked questions, not yet. But questions were coming, and when they came, Darian would be ready. His phone, retrieved by the medics, sat charging beside the bed. As soon as the nurse left, Darian pressed the emergency contact shortcut. Micah Wren's voice answered within 2 rings. "Sir, I heard." "I'm alive," Darian said hoarsely. "I need you to find someone. Nolan Frey, security tech at Ascent Terminal. Quietly. He's the key, understood. No more endurance. No more silence. The wound on his head would heal, but the scar left behind would not be for hiding. He would not let Brent's shove become another whispered injustice buried beneath bureaucracy. He would drag it into the light. Force the system that bruised him to look itself in the mirror. As a nurse re-entered and checked his vitals, Darian turned his head slightly. Eyes locked on the steel railing beside the hospital bed. His grip tightened on it, not out of weakness, but out of promise. "If they wanted to break me," he whispered under his breath, voice steady now, "they forgot who built the ground they're standing on." The white hospital lights buzzed overhead, cold and unblinking, as Darian Cole blinked against the pounding in his skull. His shoulder was immobilized in a brace, gauze lining the side of his head where the fall had torn skin open. The sting of antiseptic clung to the air. He lay still, breathing slow, steady, letting his body recover even as his mind refused rest. Outside the room's glass window, murmured voices passed like whispers of doubt. But inside, Darian's thoughts were sharp, slicing through the haze of pain with growing clarity. Micah Wren entered quietly, his expression clouded with urgency. In his hand, a black folder. "They've already circulated the report," he said, voice low. It's labeled non-compliance and accidental contact. He handed over a printout, and Darian scanned the sanitized phrases: sterile, rehearsed, and utterly false. Subject resisted inspection, became uncooperative, fell during attempt to de-escalate, Darian read aloud, his jaw tightening with every line. He looked up at Micah, eyes narrowed. "They're framing it as my fault." Micah nodded grimly. "And worse, the terminal footage has been flagged. Access is restricted. Someone locked it before internal review could even start." Darian exhaled, his fingers curling slightly against the fabric of his blanket. "Rafe Doran?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Micah hesitated. "It came from his office," he confirmed. "Time-stamped about an hour after the incident." The name settled over the room like a lead weight. Rafe Doran, the airport's head of security. Calculated, connected, and careful. If he was involved, this wasn't just damage control. It was a cover-up. Darian's memory flickered back to the blur of faces as he tumbled down that escalator, and the voice of that young technician, Nolan Frey. The feed didn't delete like he thinks. That whisper had not been casual. It had been a lifeline. "Find him," Darian said suddenly. His voice, though raspy, held steel. "Quietly. No names and messages, no trail. I need to know what he saw and what he saved." Micah gave a slow nod, already reaching for his phone. "Understood." Outside, wind rattled the window pane, distant aircraft roaring overhead in takeoff. Inside, silence returned, thick with tension. Meanwhile, back at the Ascend terminal, Brent Larker strode through the security lounge like a man freshly polished. He tossed his ID badge on the table with theatrical flair, grinning as his colleagues asked what had happened. "Handled it," he said with a smirk, biting into a vending machine protein bar. Guy got mouthy, stumbled backward. "End of story." "Management cool with it?" one of the guards asked uneasily. Brent shrugged. "Reports filed. Doran's on board. PR team's already spinning it." He leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. Won't be the first time they back the badge over the suit. Unseen by them, whispers had already begun in corners of the terminal. A janitor had caught a glimpse of the blood. A cafe worker had seen the push. Screenshots from security monitors had been quietly passed from phone to phone, each one blurring the line between fact and fiction. But in the sterile chill of his hospital room, Darian wasn't thinking about rumors. He was mapping patterns. "Pull every personnel report on Brent for the last 6 months," he told Micah when he returned, "and get our firm's cybersecurity team to dig into the internal messaging logs, off record. I want eyes on anything involving incident reports, keyword flagging, or footage suppression." Micah paused. "We might hit a firewall there. This is a government-contracted facility." "Then we don't go through the front door," Darian replied. "We trace behavior patterns, timestamps, names of witnesses who were interviewed, and those who weren't." Micah didn't argue. He knew the look in Darian's eyes. Calm, yes, but behind it, fire. Over the next 48 hours, while nurses moved around him with routine care and machines beeped in quiet rhythm, Darian orchestrated something far more deliberate than recovery. Through Micah, he requested employee rosters, airport authority memos, and shifts aligned with Brent's team. He studied language patterns in past reports, finding vague phrases that echoed eerily across different dates. Subject agitated. Officer responded, with necessary intervention. Incident resolved with minimal escalation. None of it was coincidence. Brent wasn't the exception. He was the rule, the face of a pattern polished into protocol. These reports weren't written in panic. They were practiced. A knock came at the door. A different nurse entered, her face kind and impersonal. She adjusted his IV, made a note on her clipboard, then left again without a word about the story swirling outside these walls. Alone once more, Darian stared at the ceiling. His head throbbed, the bandages pulsing with each heartbeat. But the pain wasn't his focus. It was the silence. The silence after the fall. The silence in Brent's false smile. The silence in Rafe's locked footage. That silence had once been the system's greatest ally, but not anymore. When arrogance writes its own reports, Darien muttered aloud, his voice slow and cold, truth learns how to sign its name louder. The dim hum of the terminal's lower levels echoed with the distant rattle of service carts and the occasional hiss of steam from nearby utility pipes. Nolan Frey stood near a rusted maintenance door, shifting his weight from foot to foot, eyes scanning the shadowy corridor. The flickering overhead light above him cast a nervous staccato rhythm over his face, as if reflecting the unease buried in his chest. He checked his watch again, breathing sharply when the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the empty passage. Darien Cole stepped into view, his posture upright despite the sling on his left arm and a slight limp that betrayed his still-healing injuries. A security escort had trailed him to the stairwell above but obeyed his request to remain behind. This meeting wasn't official. It couldn't be. Nolan tensed as Darien approached, then spoke quickly in a low voice. "I don't have long. If they trace this to me—" "They won't," Darien replied calmly, though the steel in his voice left no room for error. "You said you had something. Show me." Nolan swallowed hard, then pulled a tablet from his coat, glancing down the corridor one last time. "Brent, he bragged about it, you know? The shove, like it was a game. Said you were asking for it." His voice cracked slightly. Then he went into the control room and manually disabled the primary feed from that section of the terminal. Darien's expression didn't change, but a cold wind seemed to pass between them. "He thought that was enough?" "He didn't know about the backup redundancy," Nolan whispered, tapping the tablet awake. "A maintenance protocol, the backup's right to an isolated server every 90 seconds. I had access." Briefly, he turned the screen toward Darien. The footage played in jittery grayscale, grainy but damning. Brent's figure stepped into frame, postured with false authority. Darien stood tall, calm, speaking, though the footage had no sound. Then it happened. Brent's hand shot forward. Darien's body twisted in the air as the escalator steps consumed his balance, flinging him backward into a brutal, tumbling descent. Passengers in the background recoiled. One woman reached out instinctively. Another covered her mouth in horror. Darien watched in silence, face expressionless, though his jaw clenched tightly. His good hand slowly curled into a fist by his side. Nolan paused the video. "I saved that clip before they revoked my access key. I burned it to a private drive. I didn't tell anyone." "You're sure no one else knows?" Darien asked, eyes still fixed on the frozen frame. Nolan hesitated. "Rafe Doran knows. He was in the system logs minutes after I pulled it. Ever since then, I've been shut out of everything. I'm not even on the rotation schedule this week. I think they're watching me." Darien turned to face him fully now. "You did the right thing. But if Rafe is hunting leaks, you need protection." "I don't want money," Nolan said, voice firm now. I didn't sign up for this kind of silence." "You won't have to be silent," Darien replied, lowering his voice. "I have people who specialize in exposing what others try to bury. Lawyers, media allies. But you need to stay quiet until I move." Nolan nodded once, his breath catching. "I'm trusting you, sir." "You're trusting the truth," Darien said, pocketing the tablet. "And the truth has longer legs than power." They parted without another word. Nolan slipped into the maze of service tunnels, his footsteps fading like a disappearing witness. Darien, jaw tight, turned toward the emergency stairwell. He didn't use the elevator. Not tonight. Later, in his hospital room, he sat in the quiet hum of monitors and filtered air. His window overlooked the western skyline, where the lights of Halden City blinked like stars below. The tablet now rested on the side table, but Darien's gaze was on the steel railing of his hospital bed, the same cold metal he had gripped when his body slammed into the escalator floor days ago. He reached for the phone and dialed a single number. "Micah," he said as his assistant picked up, "I need you to deliver a package. Personally, no couriers. It goes straight to Elias Kerr. Tell him it's what he's been waiting for." As he ended the call, the wind rustled faintly against the glass. Somewhere below, life moved on, unaware of the quiet war that had begun inside this hospital room. Darian's hand returned to the steel railing. He gripped it tightly, knuckles pale against the white cast on his wrist. His reflection stared back faintly in the window, bloodless but burning with resolve. "They used force to bring me down. I'll use truth to drag them back up." Brent Larker walked the length of the Ascend terminal with a swagger that dared the world to question him. His uniform was crisp, his badge glinting under the terminal's sterile lights, but his confidence masked a growing unease. He caught the stares, sideways glances from staff, hushed murmurs from passengers. There was a shift in the air he couldn't place. Still, he pressed forward, chin high, convinced the worst had passed. The footage was restricted. The report was filed. The man had been discharged, all tied up, until he saw him. Darian Cole stood at the base of the escalator, the very one Brent had thrown him down 3 days earlier. He leaned heavily on a cane, the aftermath of a bruised shoulder evident in his posture, but his gaze was sharp, fixed like a scalpel aimed directly at Brent. The older man's tailored coat was open, revealing the unmistakable Titan Aeronautics pin on his lapel. He wasn't just standing. He was waiting. Brent's steps slowed. "Back already?" he called out with a smirk that tried to summon the same arrogance he'd felt 3 days ago. "Guess you didn't learn to stay down." Darian didn't blink. "I came to finish what you started." There was no rise in his voice, no anger, just cold precision. Brent opened his mouth to retort, but movement from his periphery stopped him. From a side corridor, a cluster of figures emerged, journalists with notepads, shoulder cameras, and mics already powered on. Their lenses snapped toward the two men with the collective hunger of a brewing scandal. "What's this?" Brent muttered, stepping back. Darian slowly ascended one step of the escalator, placing his cane beside the polished rail, the same steel that had gashed his palm. He ran his fingers along the groove in the metal, the texture familiar and chilling. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a slim, black flash drive, holding it high. Sunlight from the overhead atrium glass refracted off its surface, making it gleam. "This," he began, his voice calm but firm, "is the full, uncut footage." Cameras zoomed in, Brent's jaw clenched. "You'll see the moment his hand hit my chest," Darian continued. "You'll see the smirk, the fall, the blood, and most importantly, the truth, unedited and unburied." One of the reporters took a step forward. "Mr. Cole, are you accusing the officer of assault?" "I'm not accusing," Darian said without turning. "I'm proving." Brent took a step forward, flustered now. "You don't know what you're talking about." "That video's fake, doctored." Darian turned to face him fully. "I don't need to speak over you, Officer Larker." The footage speaks for itself. His voice echoed through the terminal. Passengers nearby had stopped walking. Gate announcements faded into background noise. Even the security desk had gone quiet, a frozen tableau of observers pretending not to watch, but very much watching. Brent looked around. Where once his uniform commanded silence, now it invited doubt. Even his fellow officers didn't move. Darian took one final step forward, standing level with the base of the escalator, the flash drive still in hand. "When those sworn to protect abuse their power," he said, locking eyes with the cameras, "this is what happens." Brent's smirk, that telltale, careless grin, finally cracked. "They pushed me down an escalator. Now I'm giving gravity back to justice." By the following morning, the footage had detonated across every major social media platform like a slow-motion grenade. The push, Brent's arm extending, Darian's body tipping backward, his skull colliding with steel, looped endlessly under the now viral hashtag Escalator Justice. News anchors paused their usual segments to replay the clip, while talking heads debated everything from racial profiling to abuse of authority. The public wasn't divided. They were incensed. Inside the glass-walled boardroom of Titan Aeronautics headquarters, the atmosphere was tense, carved from cold silence and the faint hum of city traffic below. The blinds were half-drawn, casting long gray stripes across the polished table where Darian sat with Elias Kerr. A tall man in a crisp charcoal suit, Elias moved with the precision of someone who had made a career slicing through lies. His leather-bound notepad lay open, though his pen hadn't moved in 10 minutes. "They'll go underground now," Elias said, breaking the silence. His tone was calm but edged. "Damage control will shift from public apology to internal suppression. Brent is only the start." Darian leaned back slowly, careful with the still sore muscles along his shoulder. His temple bore the ghost of a bandage, and though the swelling had reduced, the scar would remain. His eyes didn't blink when he spoke. "Then we don't just expose Brent. We expose the chain." Elias nodded, folding his hands together. "We need to anticipate retaliation, not just from Brent but from those who enabled him. If you go after the structure will push back." Darian tapped the table twice with his finger, his gaze drifting out to the skyline. The world had changed overnight, not just for him, but for anyone who had ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or disappear. "Micah's already digging," he said softly. "I asked him to trace every internal memo tied to Brent's clearance, anything marked discretionary." Just then, as if summoned, Micah Wren entered the room. He carried a slim folder, the kind used for classified audits. His face was pale, jaw tight, and his hand clenched the edge of the documents as if they might otherwise escape. "You'll want to see this," he said quietly, sliding the folder to Elias, then to Darian. Inside were 3 documents. The first was an authorization note from Rafe Doran, dated just 3 weeks prior. It contained the phrase, "discretionary enforcement for high-profile passengers," buried between bureaucratic jargon and innocuous language. The second was a directive modifying checkpoint procedures only for individuals flagged by particular internal code, and the third was a routing sheet showing Brent Larker's clearance override, approved and signed by Doran himself. Elias read in silence, then exhaled. This wasn't random. "No," Darian said, voice tightening. "This was licensed profiling." He stood, gripping the back of his chair for support. The steel in his spine wasn't just figurative, it was forged by years of being watched, dismissed, and underestimated. His mind reeled not just from the fall, but from the clarity of what he now saw. The assault wasn't an accident. It was an execution of policy. Micah added, "We also found something else. A comms thread from Brent to 2 other officers. He referred to you as a corporate type that needs humbling." Elias's pen finally moved, scribbling notes rapidly. "This opens the door for pattern analysis, not just one incident, but a systemic practice." Darian turned to the window again, but this time his reflection stared back at him, bloodless but burning with purpose. "They've built this armor from silence," he said. "If we want to crack it, we'll need noise, pressure, and precision." Micah hesitated, then offered, "Do you want to leak this today? Or wait until we secure a formal complaint?" Darian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he paced slowly toward the edge of the boardroom, fingertips grazing the cool glass. "I want every line traced. Every clearance. Every officer touched by that order." Elias nodded. "I'll get a legal team to file for discovery. But you need to understand, going public will escalate things, and it won't just be Brent's face on the front page." Darian turned, his gaze sharp. "Good." A low hum filled the room as the building's systems kicked into afternoon mode. faint echoes of wind through vents, a distant murmur of traffic, a city alive with movement. But within the room, the energy shifted. This wasn't just a fight to clear his name. This was war against a network that had operated unchecked for years. Darian closed the folder and stood fully upright, every inch of him composed but unshakable. "You don't topple the hand that shoved you," he murmured. "You expose the arm that moved it." Rafe Doran slammed the glass door of the conference room shut, the sound echoing down the sterile hallway like a gunshot. Inside, 5 security officers sat in uneasy silence around a long metal table. The air smelled faintly of coffee and anxiety. Brent Larker stood near the far end, sweat darkening the collar of his uniform. His jaw was tight, but his eyes darted from man to man, searching for any trace of support. None came. Rafe paced to the head of the table, his polished shoes clicking in rhythm with his irritation. "You realize," he began, voice low and sharp, "that this little stunt of yours could cost us everything." His gaze cut through Brent like a blade. "You were supposed to manage a situation, not create a spectacle." Brent clenched his fists. "I followed protocol. You told me to handle high-profile passengers my way. That's exactly what I did." His voice cracked halfway through, more out of fear than defiance. Rafe stopped pacing. The fluorescent lights above caught the faint scar that ran along his temple, a reminder of how many years he'd survived bureaucracy by keeping others beneath him. "Protocol," he repeated slowly, the word dripping with contempt. "If you had followed protocol, the footage would have been gone before he even hit the floor." He leaned in close enough for Brent to feel the chill of his breath. "There were no witnesses," he whispered, "until you forgot about the backup feed." The words landed like hammer strikes. Brent's face paled. He opened his mouth to respond, but Rafe raised a hand to silence him. The other officers stared straight ahead, pretending to read invisible notes, unwilling to take sides. Rafe straightened his coat, regaining his composure. "I'll contain the fallout," he said coldly, "but from this moment on, you don't speak to anyone outside this department. Not the press, not your colleagues." "No one," Brent's voice trembled. "You can't just pin this on me, Rafe." "You ordered this." Rafe's eyes snapped toward him, and the silence that followed was more dangerous than any outburst. "Careful," he said softly, stepping forward. "Do you really think I'll let a junior officer drag me down with him?" "You're on your own now, Larker." He dismissed the room with a wave of his hand. Chairs scraped, papers rustled, and one by one the others slipped out, leaving Brent alone. Rafe lingered a moment longer, adjusting his cufflinks before muttering, "You were useful, but you forgot the first rule of control: never get caught." Then he left, his reflection disappearing down the mirrored corridor. That night, Rafe sat alone in his dim office, the glow of multiple monitors reflecting off the dark windows. The building was silent except for the soft hum of servers behind the wall. He opened the encrypted security archive and navigated to the folder labeled Incident 472, Escalator. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. A single click would wipe the digital evidence clean. He hesitated only long enough to mutter, "Let's make this problem disappear." His finger pressed Enter. The progress bar filled in seconds, deleted successfully. But what Rafe didn't know was that the backup he sought to destroy had already been copied. Nolan Frey had duplicated it before his access was revoked, splitting it across 3 encrypted drives and hiding one off-site. At that very hour, Nolan sat in a dim apartment across town, his hands shaking as he sealed a small black drive into a padded envelope. The flickering lamplight caught his anxious face. He wasn't built for danger, he was a technician, not a whistleblower, yet he understood the weight of what he held. Every pixel of that footage was a truth someone powerful wanted buried. A knock startled him. It was soft, then repeated. Nolan froze. He glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. No one should have known where he lived. He crept to the peephole, but the hallway outside was empty. A chill crawled up his spine. Meanwhile, across the city, Darian Cole sat in a quiet corner of the Halden Ledger's newsroom, the faint hum of printers filling the air. Opposite him sat Mason Redden, a lean journalist with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. He'd seen corruption before, but the footage on Darian's drive made him go still. "This isn't just assault," Mason murmured, replaying the clip. "This is authorization from the top." "You're going to make enemies, Mr. Cole." "I already have," Darian replied, his tone calm but heavy with determination. He leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the table. "If I release this recklessly, they'll frame it as personal vengeance. I need strategy, not noise." Mason nodded slowly. "Then we release it in parts, one leak at a time. Each one tighter than the last, each piece harder to refute. By the time they react, the pattern will already be clear." Darian considered the idea. "Controlled exposure," he said, "enough to trap them in their own lies." But as the plan formed between them, Darian's phone buzzed violently on the table. Nolan's name flashed on the screen. He answered immediately. "Nolan, what's wrong?" The voice on the other end was trembling, urgent. "Someone's been outside my building all night." I think they followed me from work. I saw a car parked near the corner. Same one. No plates. Lock your doors," Darian said firmly, standing from his chair. His pulse quickened. "I'll send someone." But the line cut out mid-sentence. Static filled the air, followed by silence. Mason's brow furrowed. "What happened?" Darian lowered the phone slowly, his expression hardening. "He's in danger." The journalist's eyes darkened with concern. "You think it's Rafe?" "I don't think," Darian said quietly. "I know." Outside, the city lights of Halden flickered like nervous fireflies. Somewhere beyond them, the machinery of cover-up was already grinding into motion, silent, methodical, and merciless. As Darian left the newsroom, the night air bit sharply against his skin. He walked with steady purpose, though his thoughts raced beneath the surface. He had underestimated how far Rafe's influence reached, how many hands it could command in the dark. But now there was no turning back. He looked toward the glowing terminal skyline in the distance, the place where it all began, and whispered to himself, as if marking a vow, "When truth starts walking, lies start running." He shoved the black CEO down the escalator, watching his head slam into the metal steps as blood spread across the floor. If you believe power without compassion is corruption, hit subscribe now, because justice rises where arrogance falls. The phone rang once, then again. On the third ring, Darian answered. There was no greeting, just a pause. Then a voice came through, distorted, metallic, as if masked through a voice changer. "You don't know who you're fighting." The line went dead. Darian froze. He stood alone in the dim hallway of his apartment, one hand still holding the receiver, the other braced against the wall. The silence that followed was more deafening than the voice itself. For a long moment, he didn't move. The shadows of the city filtered through the blinds, crawling across the floor like slow-moving smoke. Then the second call came, not to him, but to Elias. It was Nolan's landlord. He had found the door to Nolan's apartment forced open and the interior ransacked. No sign of Nolan. The technician was missing. By the time Darian arrived, flashing red and blue lights painted the narrow hallway of the old building. Officers paced inside the apartment, careful not to disturb potential evidence. The space looked like it had been torn apart by someone both desperate and calculated. Drawers emptied, cushions gutted. Even the ceiling panels had been disturbed. A detective, lean and middle-aged, met Darian at the doorway. "You a relative?" "No," Darian replied, stepping forward, his voice low. "I'm the reason he was targeted." The detective squinted, unsure how to respond. Micah appeared behind him, breathless. "The tablet's gone," he whispered. Darian's face hardened, but only for a second. "It won't matter," he murmured. He synced it. They returned to the car. Inside, Darian connected his encrypted drive to his laptop. The backup was there, intact. The footage Nolan had risked everything for still lived. The thought of Nolan, possibly harmed or worse, made Darian's stomach twist. He felt a strange, quiet fury build inside him, not hot and explosive, but cold and calculating. It was a fury that didn't scream. It moved silently, like a tide that dragged entire cities under without a sound. He opened a secure communication line and dialed a number he hadn't used in 2 years. When the line picked up, a voice answered with cautious familiarity. "Cole?" "Julian." It's time Julian Marin, Director of Ethical Oversight for the Federal Investigations Bureau, had once been Darian's contact during the drone regulation hearings. They hadn't spoken since, but the trust remained. Darian wasted no time. He recounted everything: the shove at the escalator, Brent's lies, the backup footage, Rafe's interference, the threats, the deleted files, and now Nolan's disappearance. Julian listened in silence. At the end, he exhaled deeply. "This goes beyond airport misconduct," Julian said. "You're telling me you've got evidence of targeted enforcement against civilians, falsified reports, and a missing whistleblower?" "Yes." There was another long pause. "I'll open a confidential inquiry," Julian finally said. "But listen carefully. This is going to draw heat. Political pressure, bureaucratic resistance. They won't let this unravel easily, especially not if names start surfacing." "I'm not waiting for permission," Darian replied. "I'm already in the fire." Julian didn't argue. That night, Elias filed an emergency injunction in federal court to prevent any surveillance deletions by the airport authority. The motion cited active obstruction of justice and witness endangerment. While the court processed the motion, Darian sat alone in his study, watching the city blur through the rain-streaked glass. He hadn't slept in nearly 36 hours. The ache behind his temple pulsed from his injuries, but the pain had become background noise, an old companion. His phone buzzed again, this time a message from Micah. "Media alert. Crowds gathering outside Ascend Terminal. #Escalator Justice trending." Darian turned the phone over. He didn't need to see the details. He already knew what was happening. The storm had started. As legal documents flew and cameras crowded his doorstep, Darian realized something undeniable. He was no longer just the CEO of Titan Aeronautics, no longer just a man recovering from a violent fall. He had become a lightning rod for something far larger than himself. Every step he took now echoed in rooms he couldn't see. Every breath he drew made someone behind the curtain nervous. Micah stepped into the room quietly and set a fresh cup of coffee down beside him. "You all right, sir?" he asked. Darian didn't answer at first. He looked at the cufflink still resting beside his laptop, the one torn from his sleeve during the fall. Then he looked back at Micah. "They wanted to erase one man," he said quietly, "but they awakened 1,000 watching." Brent Larker yanked his hood lower and kept his head down as he weaved through the back corridors of Halden Central Station. He had dyed his hair a lighter shade, swapped his uniform for a weathered jacket, and tossed his badge into the river 2 days ago. The city that once gave him power now swallowed him in shadow. Every reflective surface, shop windows, the dark glass of a parked patrol car felt like a trap. The headlines were everywhere. He'd seen the footage, he'd read the comments, he knew the world had turned against him, but he hadn't expected this level of pressure. He thought he'd have time to vanish, maybe hop a freight train or head toward the coast. Anything to escape the questions, the cameras, and worst of all, the guilt slowly burning holes into his mind. That guilt now had a name: Darian Cole. Brent reached for the service stairwell that led to the lower level of the station, hoping to slip out unnoticed. That's when the voice behind him cut through the air like a cold blade. "Brent Larker." "Stop where you are." He froze, spun slowly. Two plainclothes officers stood at the end of the corridor, badges lifted just enough to be seen. Behind them, another pair emerged from the far stairwell. Brent's knees almost buckled. "You don't understand," he started, hands raised, voice shaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. On your knees." Now the moment his knees hit the floor, something inside him gave way. Not just fear, something older, something he had buried beneath years of bitterness and misplaced pride. The interrogation room was dim, the overhead light flickering ever so slightly. Brent sat cuffed, his hands trembling slightly as Internal Affairs Agent Monroe placed a thick file on the table. Across from him, another man entered. Director Julian Marin. Tall, steady, and expressionless, Julian sat without a word, letting the silence do the work. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "You were trying to flee a federal investigation." Brent didn't respond. "You understand obstruction adds years, but if you cooperate now, you might help yourself." Brent looked up, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with sleeplessness. "It wasn't just me," he muttered. "You think I came up with that on my own?" Julian remained quiet, listening. "Rafe Doran gave the order," Brent continued, his words gaining momentum like a dam cracking. "He told me to remind the executive who's in charge. Said Darien was getting too comfortable. Said someone needed to show him how things work here." Agent Monroe leaned forward, voice skeptical. "And the push?" Brent looked away. "I thought he'd just stumble. Get embarrassed. Not bleed. Not like that. Yet you stood there and lied." Brent's fists clenched. "Rafe said it'd blow over. Said the cameras were scrubbed." Julian nodded slowly, tapping the file. "We have the transcript of this conversation. A full confession." It was over. Brent knew it. He leaned back, eyes closed, whispering more to himself than anyone else. "He used us like chess pieces." We were nothing to him. The transcript leaked within hours. It appeared first on independent news forums, then on major outlets. The public read every word, and this time there was no ambiguity. Brent's voice, confessing, unraveling, was damning. Rafe Doran's name was stamped across every paragraph. By dusk, crowds had gathered outside Ascend Terminal. They weren't angry just for Darien anymore. They were angry for every silent humiliation they'd endured, every time someone in uniform acted above the law. Signs waved above the mass. "Gravity doesn't lie. We saw the push," and "Justice takes the stairs." At the center of the plaza, a temporary platform had been assembled. A microphone stood unattended until a familiar figure approached, Darien Cole. He walked with a cane, still favoring his side, but his posture remained proud. Flanked by colleagues and guarded subtly by security, he stepped up to the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces. Flashbulbs fired, phones recorded. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The push was physical," Darien began, eyes scanning the crowd, "but the intent was systemic." A wave of silence followed, charged, electric. "This is not about one fall. It's about every unseen hand that made people afraid to stand tall." The crowd erupted in applause. Some cheered, others simply nodded, tearfully. But one thing was certain. This was no longer just about Brent. It was about a structure, a culture, a sickness that had used uniforms and false authority to shield itself from consequence. And now, thanks to Brent's confession, that armor had cracked. Inside the nearby courthouse, Elias Kerr reviewed the newly submitted chain of evidence. Brent's confession had become the missing puzzle piece. It pointed directly to falsified reports, altered screening protocols, and executive-level targeting. When Elias handed the folder to Darien that evening, he said quietly, "This gives us everything." Darien took it with both hands. "Sometimes," he told Elias, "the weakest link is the one holding the chain." The courtroom doors creaked open just as Rafe Doran stepped onto the witness stand. The overhead lights glared off the polished wood surfaces, casting long shadows across the floor. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens ready, cameras blinking red. Elias Kerr sat forward slightly at the plaintiff's table, eyes locked on the man who had orchestrated so much behind the scenes. And just a few feet away, Darian Cole sat still, shoulders squared, head still wrapped in gauze from the injury that had started all of this. His calm demeanor masked the storm behind his gaze. Rafe adjusted his tie and leaned into the microphone. "What occurred at Ascend Terminal was not the result of malice," he began, voice steady. "It was the unfortunate consequence of a few isolated errors in protocol." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Elias rose slowly from his seat, buttoning his jacket with calm precision. His tone was razor-sharp. "Mr. Doran, were these isolated errors also behind the internal memo you authorized, dated March 12th, which granted discretionary enforcement against high-profile individuals?" Rafe blinked. Elias lifted a printed document. "This one here, marked with your initials at the bottom, stating, and I quote, 'Adjust scrutiny protocols for corporate travelers, especially foreign dignitaries and executives flagged as non-compliant in prior scans.' Is this your signature?" Rafe leaned forward, squinting. The silence in the courtroom was stifling. Finally, he nodded. "That document was taken out of context." Before he could finish, Elias gestured to his team. A large monitor flickered to life beside the judge's bench. "Let's give it some context, then." The screen displayed a series of emails, messages between Rafe and senior officers, one after another outlining a clear pattern of manipulation. Officers were directed to apply heightened pressure during screenings. Certain passengers were red-flagged not for behavior, but for profile. Each revelation hit like a slow-moving avalanche. The gallery sat frozen, breathless. The judge leaned slightly forward, a frown creasing his brow. Rafe tried to recover. This was an internal policy matter. Misinterpreted. There was no targeting. Elias didn't blink. "So, you're saying this next piece of evidence will also be misinterpreted?" The lights dimmed slightly as a final clip began to play. The grainy footage was already familiar, Brent Larker's hand extending, shoving Darian violently down the escalator. Gasps echoed in the room once again, even though the image had been shared across the internet weeks earlier. But what followed was new. From the top of the footage, amid the muffled sounds of crowd chatter and the soft rumble of the escalator, a voice emerged. It was low, but clear, calm, calculated. "Make an example of him." Darian didn't need to look at the screen. He had memorized every frame. But now, hearing the voice, that voice, confirmed what he had long suspected. Rafe Doran's face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. He looked to his attorney, who was already burying his face in his hands. The judge rapped his gavel twice. "Order in the court." The gallery exploded in whispers and gasps. Some reporters had already started typing before the judge even finished speaking. Elias turned toward Darian briefly, giving a barely perceptible nod. Darian, still seated, met Rafe's eyes at last. No anger, no malice, only certainty. After court was adjourned for the day, reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Cameras pointed in every direction. A voice called out, "Mr. Cole." "What would you say to the man who tried to silence you?" Darian paused, turning slowly to face the crowd. His voice was low but unwavering. "You thought you were pushing me down the stairs," he said softly to reporters afterward, "but you were only pushing yourself closer to the edge." The fluorescent lights of the Halden Municipal Hearing Room buzzed faintly as the first of many officials stepped into the semicircular chamber, their eyes darting nervously beneath sharp brows. Camera shutters clicked in rapid bursts. Outside, a sea of reporters clamored behind barricades while security held them back. Inside, the silence was stifling. The investigation had begun. Darian Cole sat at a narrow table on the far end of the room, shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. He wore a charcoal gray suit, his bandage now reduced to a thin white strip above his right temple. Despite the insistence of Titan Aeronautics board members that he take a temporary leave for safety and optics, Darien had declined. Safety, he believed, did not come from retreat. It came from exposure, from truth. Instead of withdrawing, he converted Titan's in-house communications division into a public evidence team. Daily briefings, posted timelines, verified documents, every lie buried beneath bureaucracy was now being dug up, one layer at a time, and displayed in stark daylight. This move gained him admiration from the public but made him a target for others. Threats, unsigned and mailed from anonymous sources, began arriving in clusters. His head of security, Marcus Hale, insisted on round-the-clock protection. Darien barely flinched. At 10:07 a.m., he received the request that would shift the day. "Brent Larker wants to speak with you," Marcus said quietly, holding out a printed form. "Private, in person, no counsel present." Darien paused, reading the line again. The man who shoved him down an escalator, the man who sparked this fire, was now behind steel bars, waiting for him. Every logical instinct screamed decline, but something in Darien's gut, the same instinct that had built an aerospace empire out of ash, said yes. Later that afternoon, in a low-ceilinged holding room at Halden Correctional Facility, Darien sat across from Brent. The glass barrier was absent. No handcuffs, no table between them. Just a single ceiling fan spinning above and the faint tick of a wall clock. Brent looked thinner, face hollowed, his cocky demeanor stripped away like paint under pressure. His hands fidgeted with the corner of his prison-issued shirt. "I didn't think you'd come," Brent said hoarsely, avoiding eye contact. Darien didn't answer. He sat still, eyes steady. The silence pressed Brent to continue. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," Brent said, his voice cracking slightly. "They gave me orders. He gave me orders." "Rafe." He swallowed hard. "He said, you needed reminding." That some people weren't above the rules, Darien tilted his head. "That's your excuse? That you were following orders?" Brent's eyes finally met his, watery and raw. He had leverage on us. All of us. Officers, guards, even supervisors. Fake misconduct reports. Financial threats. We were just pieces in a system. He paused, gripping the edge of his chair. "He told me to intimidate you, not throw you down the escalator. But I got carried away." The words hung in the air, heavy with guilt and regret. "You became the weapon," Darien said quietly, voice smooth as glass. "That, cut yourself." Brent lowered his head, hands clenched, saying nothing. Outside a storm brewed, not of weather, but of protest. Hundreds had gathered near the courthouse, their chants low but unified, their signs sharp. No more pushes, no more lies. Inside, Darien rose to his feet without another word. As he stepped into the hallway, Marcus Hale met him with a nod. "How did it go?" he asked. Darien glanced back at the closed room before answering. "He's not the only one who cracked. He's just the first to admit it." That night, as darkness folded over Halden City, the Titan Aeronautics building glowed like a lighthouse against the skyline. Inside his office on the 27th floor, Darien sat at his desk, surrounded by maps, files, and evidence matrices. The window before him reflected not just his own face, but a city watching, a nation watching. In a video message later that evening, filmed in a quiet studio with no teleprompter, he addressed the public. "Some people believe justice is a storm," he said into the lens, his voice measured. "But storms pass. What we need is not thunder. What we need is accuracy, discipline, unshakable intent." He paused. His fingers brushed over a printed image of the escalator, a still frame frozen in time. Justice, he continued, isn't noise. It's precision. The courtroom was silent as Rafe Doran rose from his seat, his once confident posture now stiff with dread. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber like a gavel striking steel. For abuse of power, falsification of records, and obstruction of justice, this court finds you guilty on all counts. Gasps rippled faintly from the gallery, but Darian Cole remained unmoved. He sat at the witness bench in a dark charcoal suit, bandage still faintly visible along his hairline, a remnant of the escalator fall that had started it all. His fingers rested calmly on the table before him, yet beneath that stillness was fire, a fire he had learned to control with discipline, not fury. Rafe didn't look at him. He hadn't looked at Darian once since the verdict was read, but Darian's gaze never left the man who had tried to erase him with a lie. The court, the judge continued, recognizes this case as a landmark example of civil accountability in the face of institutional prejudice. Let this sentence serve as a warning. Silence is no longer a shield for power. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone with the same indifferent glare it always had, but for the reporters gathered near the steps, this day was anything but ordinary. Darian stepped outside to a wall of flashing cameras and microphones. He offered no grand speech, only a measured statement. Justice is not about volume. It's about precision. Today, we made that clear. The wind caught the edge of his coat as he descended the stone steps, each footfall deliberate, as though grounding himself in the new reality he had forged. But this wasn't an ending. It was a pivot, a beginning that demanded structure, not just legal, but moral. Weeks later, in a modest press conference hall beside Titan Aeronautics headquarters, Darian unveiled the Ascend Initiative. The logo, simple yet symbolic, showed an upward staircase emerging from the shadow of a broken rail, a direct tribute to the steel escalator that had cut into his flesh and reshaped his mission. Flanked by board members and civil rights advisors, Darian took the podium. His voice was calm, unwavering. This initiative exists to protect the rights of passengers, especially those often silenced by systems that claim to protect them. Airports, transit terminals, and law enforcement hubs should never be stages for abuse. The room filled with quiet nods. A few reporters scribbled notes. One lifted his hand, asking, "Mr. Cole, will the initiative be nationwide?" Darian answered without pause, "It must be." Over the following months, the Ascend Initiative rolled out its first set of reforms. Hotline numbers posted in every terminal, anonymous reporting systems for passenger profiling, mandatory de-escalation training for transit officers, and a quarterly transparency audit. Airports that resisted compliance found themselves publicly named on the initiative's website, a list that soon gained traction in media as the Watchtower Roll. But the most emotional moment came at the Integrity Awards ceremony, an intimate, candlelit evening where families of whistleblowers and reformers gathered to honor courage. There, in a velvet-curtained auditorium, Darian stepped forward to announce the first-ever recipient of the Nolan Frey Integrity Medal. He held the medal up for the room to see, the engraved surface catching the light. Nolan wasn't a man seeking attention. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't rich. But he did the one thing this world often punishes: he told the truth. This medal is not just for him, but for every silent witness who speaks when others hide. The audience stood in solemn applause. Several men dabbed tears discreetly from their eyes. In the front row, Nolan's older brother, Marcus, clutched the plaque with both hands, nodding slowly as if receiving something long overdue. That night, media outlets across the country ran the same headline: "Poetic Justice, the rail that broke him now holds up a nation." And yet, Darian knew justice wasn't made in headlines. It was felt in the quiet rooms where policy changed, where officers relearned how to protect instead of dominate, and where travelers finally felt human again. The final gesture came months later when the airport authority, now under new leadership, invited Darien to a private ceremony to unveil the newly revised passenger safety policy. The gathering was small. Only a few members of the press were allowed. The escalator stood polished beneath soft golden lights, its rails gleaming like forged armor. Darien approached it alone. The air was still. His footsteps echoed faintly against the terminal floor. Reaching out, he placed his hand on the steel rail, feeling its cool, silent strength beneath his palm. His eyes closed for a moment, as memory folded into resolve. Then he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Pain built the foundation," he whispered, "and truth became the steps." Darien Cole stepped onto the sleek, elevated platform inside the massive exhibition hangar, the hush of anticipation rolling across the gathered audience like a low tide. Cameras clicked. Lights shimmered off the curved titanium frame of the Horizon 9, Titan Aeronautics' newest aircraft, a marvel of engineering born from pain. Behind Darien, the towering silhouette of the plane loomed under cascading white lights, its streamlined body reflecting back every detail of the stage beneath it. Engineers, press, and foreign dignitaries from across the world had gathered for the unveiling, but Darien's focus wasn't on them. It was on what this moment represented, not innovation, but vindication. He didn't read from notes. His voice, steady and deliberate, filled the space. "This is not a speech about propulsion systems," he began, hands folded in front of him, gaze firm. "It's not about velocity or altitude. It's about dignity, about designing a future where safety is not a privilege." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle over the crowd, but right as murmurs of agreement rose gently from the audience, Darien scanned the room. He recognized a few board members, even a former senator who had once tried to dissuade him from going public. None of them mattered now. What mattered was that the Horizon 9's AI-integrated systems, specifically the onboard passenger monitoring technology that could flag bias-based security alerts, were now part of industry standard. Every rivet in that aircraft was a statement. Later that night, after the reception had quieted and the hangar emptied, Darien sat alone in his office overlooking the city skyline. The lights of Halden City blinked in rhythmic pulses far below, and a steady rain tapped against the glass walls behind him. His desk was clean except for a black envelope placed precisely at the center, addressed by hand. He knew who it was from before opening it. The handwriting was stiff, angular, unfamiliar in tone but familiar in weight. Brent Larker. Darien unfolded the single sheet inside. There was no apology, no defense. Just one line. "You showed me what standing back up really means." He sat still, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. For a long time, he said nothing. He didn't know whether to feel anger or mercy. There was a gravity in the sentence that caught him off guard, a crack in the wall of bitterness he'd spent months cementing. He didn't forgive Brent. Not yet. But he understood something deeper, that sometimes the greatest form of accountability was not punishment, but transformation. Darien leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the drawer on the right side of the desk. Slowly, he opened it. Inside, nestled beside an aged brass pen and a few archived letters, sat the broken cufflink he had worn the day he was pushed. The gold was bent, the face cracked, yet he had never replaced it. He placed Brent's letter beside it, gently, as though preserving a fragment of history. Somewhere beyond the rain and the glass, a siren wailed faintly, swallowed by the hum of the city below. A new chapter was beginning, not just for Titan, but for every passenger who would board its aircraft, for every man who had been judged before spoken to, for every voice that had been silenced by protocol. Darien whispered to the room, not for anyone to hear, but for himself. "Some falls break bones," he murmured, "but others rebuild men." He sent a man tumbling down in humiliation, and moments later was dragged back up by the same steel he abused. If you believe no cruelty should go unanswered, subscribe now, because justice doesn't stay at the bottom, it climbs. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, humiliation, and the abuse of power in public spaces. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, equality, and accountability when authority is misused.